Hi, I'm Victor, the main organizer of the Full Stack Flutter conference. On this channel, we publish the best talks from the conference every week throughout the year, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. I'm also the founder of Serverpod, so if you want to build your backend in Dart, make sure to check that out. This talk will teach us how to build full stack Flutter apps with Serverpod from Kieran Lee. Kieran is the founder of MyOpNotes, an app that helps surgeons in the UK take better notes during operations. Let's go!
Hello and welcome to my talk introducing you to full stack Flutter using Serverpod. My name's Kieran Lee. I'm a founder, or one of the founders, and the CTO for MyOpNotes. I've been an application developer for just over 8 years now, and I've been a Flutter developer for just over 3. Been using Serverpod since version 0.9.2, so pretty much since the start, before it was officially released. And we still use it in MyOpNotes to this day. And I wanted to give you this talk because when I was searching for solutions and stacks and technologies to go with for MyOpNotes, I didn't really feel like there was any one good resource that kind of gave you an overview, a bit of a comparison, and that's what we're going to do here today. So, what will we be covering? Well, first of all, we're going to cover what is full stack Flutter and how does it work. Secondly, we're going to cover how does it stack up against the competition. So we'll be comparing it to common alternatives like Firebase, Supabase, and even completely non-Flutter stacks, and how you would normally traditionally do it. We're going to be talking about what it's like in the real world, and we're going to be using MyOpNotes as a case study for that. And finally, we're going to talk about why you might consider using it for your next project. So let's jump straight in. So what is full stack Flutter? Dart and Flutter usually come as a pair. Dart is the coding language, Flutter is the UI framework, Serverpod is your server framework. What is Dart? So Dart is a programming language that was developed by Google and first unveiled in 2011. It was originally developed as an alternative to JavaScript. However, it's a completely object-oriented, class-based, garbage-collected language that borrows syntax from other C-style languages. And it's incredibly quick as well because it can compile to completely native machine code, JavaScript or WebAssembly, so it can target a lot of platforms. It supports concurrency, null safety, and both just-in-time and ahead-of-time compilation. So what does that mean? It means that if you need a very intensive application running on multiple threads, then Dart will support that with concurrency, but it doesn't support it in the same way that multi-threading works because each of the isolates that Dart uses actually has its own memory, so it kind of reduces some of the issues that you would normally have when building multi-threaded applications. Null safety essentially means that you can't code bad code that will error on a null. And what that means is it captures a lot of the bugs that you would usually find during testing or production because something comes through as a null value when you weren't expecting it. It captures those at the development stage. And just-in-time and ahead-of-time compilation? Well, just-in-time is really good for development because it means that you can see whenever you make a change exactly when you make that change. And ahead of time is really good for production releases because it can compile everything ahead of time into a super performant little package that then gets sent over and ran using machine code. So it's the best of both worlds. It supports both. And finally, it's got a really rich ecosystem. Pub.dev has a plethora of packages which have definitely come in handy for us at MyOpNotes. If you ever have a use case that's a specific, oh, I need to connect to this, or maybe some validation or something like that, then there's a good chance there's a package that's already been built that's out there that can do that for you. It's got plenty of tutorials and online learning support, and it even has really good developer tools, but also learning tools such as Dartpad, which is actually accessible through the Dart website, and it's essentially an in-browser code editing tool that lets you run and execute code just so you can test it before you start building applications. So Flutter, what is Flutter? Flutter was developed by Google again and officially released in 2018. It's a Dart UI toolkit essentially, so it's a layer on top of Dart that allows you to build really rich, natively compiled, cross-platform UIs, which are consistent across all platforms. If you want them to be, they can also look like native applications, and essentially you've got control over every pixel on the page due to the way that Flutter runs. So you can pretty much have any sort of custom UI for any platform built with Flutter. It's got a widget-based architecture, which means everything in Flutter is a widget. And this is really good because the entirety of the UI framework is built on this idea of reuse of these widgets that you can reuse all across your application. They give you sets of out-of-the-box widgets, which tend to emulate native behavior, so like Material widgets or Cupertino widgets for iOS. Or you can create your own completely custom widgets, or even extend off of the base widgets and create your own reusable components all throughout your UI. In MyOpNotes, we actually built our own UI library, which we use across the entire application. So whenever we need to build a new screen, it's more of a case of putting the Lego blocks together rather than having to code anything completely from scratch. It also, as I discussed with Dart, has hot reload, which when you're just talking about Dart is nice, but when you include Flutter as well, it's really good because it means that the minute you type something or change the UI, change the layout, change a widget, change colors, it instantly hot reloads next to you. So you can see those changes in real time as you're developing them. And then finally, we get to Serverpod. So what is Serverpod? Well, if Flutter is the UI framework for Dart, then Serverpod is the server framework for Dart. So if you were to compare that to something like full stack JavaScript development, Dart would be equivalent to JavaScript, Flutter would be equivalent to something like React or Vue, and Serverpod would be equivalent to something like Node.js. So you get a better idea of how it all works. It was originally developed by Victor Lidholt, who was from the Flutter team, and released in 2023. It's open source, a scalable app server written in Dart, so it's written in the same language as the rest of your stack, and it provides a seamlessly type-safe way to interact with your backend from your front end, and vice versa as well. So where you would normally be used to sending messages in string format up and across the wire, what Serverpod actually allows you to do is send those objects as objects, because Serverpod does some really clever magic in between that takes care of the whole request, serialization, deserialization process. So it's pretty much as easy as calling a method on your back end is pretty much as easy as calling a method on the local code repository on your front end application. It's got built-in authentication, file uploads, logging, caching, task schedules, health checks, deployment, and it even has a web server. So there's a lot that comes with Serverpod, and it's one of the main benefits is that it just does so much for you out of the box that you would normally otherwise have to code yourself. And finally, it has custom Terraform scripts for AWS and GCP setup. Which really does help because I'm a developer, I'm not an infrastructure engineer. So, any help I can get on the infrastructure, which I'm sure is the same for a lot of you guys out there, is very much appreciated. And the custom Terraform scripts that come with Serverpod are incredibly detailed. They will set up all of your database, your routing system, they'll stick a CDN in there. There's a lot that goes on in those Terraform scripts, which basically creates you a super scalable infrastructure. So what happens when you put them all together? How does it all connect? How does it work? Well, like any application or any sort of project that you work on in development, it all starts at the terminal. And Serverpod actually has a CLI tool, which you can install on your terminal, which gives you access to all of the Serverpod CLI commands. And one of those commands is to create your app. So you run your little create app command, and what that does is it will create you a directory with your project in it. That directory consists of three main pillars. The first one is your front-end application, which is just a pure Flutter front-end application. So if you already have an existing Flutter application, you could literally just drag and drop that into the directory and it should work. The second pillar is the back-end server. Again, this is just another standard Dart application. So any Dart code will work on this server. And this is essentially the thing that will run on your infrastructure versus the front-end UI application. And then sat in the middle of those two is where the magic happens. So this is the Serverpod client, a completely generated Dart library that Serverpod creates based on the code that you've written in your server. So it's a really clever tool, but essentially analyzes your server. It looks at things like the endpoints that you've written. It looks at things like the models that you've defined and a bunch of other things. And it essentially generates an entire Dart library that is specific to your code. It will generate endpoints. It will generate models for you. It will build methods into those models for serialization and deserialization. It will build things like copy with. And not only does the client build code so that you can just start using it in your application, so you can start using all of the classes that are generated, but it actually takes care of the communication layer as well. So whenever your app wants to talk to your server, because the client that is generated is just a standard Dart library, what's actually happening here is you've got your front end application and the client is included in the front end application. It's a dependency of the front end application. And then you've got your back end server, which is a separate application, and the same again. So the client gets included as a dependency to the back end application. So you've got your front end and your back end, but sat between them, you've got these two layers of the client. And what happens is when your app wants to send information to your backend or call a method on an endpoint, it first uses the client to serialize them into a string. It then sends that across the wire to your server, where the server's version of the client, the dependency, will receive that message and put it back into a Dart object before it even gets to your server. So that's why I do really think this is the magic in the middle, because from the app side of things, it just looks like you're calling a local method. Not to mention that because your entire stack, these three pillars are separate folders, but they all live within the same directory. So because your entire stack is in one directory, that means that all of it has one single version control, which actually comes in really handy when you hook up GitHub and GitHub Actions. Because if you want to make a change to the server, or if you want to make a change to the app, then you can compile your code, you can push it using automated deployment, and both will get pushed at the exact same time. So you'll never have a disparity between your server's logic and the API that's expected to come in and your application, because both of them get pushed at the exact same time. In addition to that, the server also comes with Terraform scripts. The server runs wherever you want it to, so AWS or GCP, whilst the application is downloaded and installed on the client, unless you're on web, in which case it is also provided, which Serverpod can actually do. But the server actually comes with scripts to set up that infrastructure for you, which means that you've now got one project which, from one command that you've created with the CLI, you've got a front end, you've got a back end, you've got a completely generated client that contains a database object relational mapper, it contains serialization methods, pretty much everything to do with your code that you would normally have to code as boilerplate is there for you. It's all managed using the same version control, and the infrastructure is all managed through files and scripts as well, which means that whenever you want to change the infrastructure, that's also stored in the version control. So it really does neaten the entire application building process. So how does it stack up against the competition? Serverpod versus Firebase. Now, this is a tricky one because Serverpod and Firebase are two very different products. Firebase is essentially like the managed service. It's very proprietary. There's a bit of lock-in in terms of options, and you're a little bit limited in terms of your customizability. Whereas Serverpod is a package that is usually, it's a framework within code. So it's equivalent to something like Laravel for PHP or Ruby on Rails or Django or something like that. And so Serverpod uses Postgres, another open source project, and it supports live data, real-time updates using Dart streams. Whereas Firebase uses Firestore, which is a proprietary NoSQL database that natively supports real-time updates. So you can listen to changes on your database. And although Serverpod does support it, it's a little bit more manual than what Firebase offers. So yeah, obviously Serverpod differs from Firestore slightly because you access it in code rather than using SDKs as well. So Firebase, you're using their SDKs and it's a little less custom, whereas because Serverpod's generated essentially all of your models specific for your code, it's all custom generated code that kind of takes away a lot of the stress of dealing with that data. What about Supabase? Now, Supabase is often branded as the sort of open source SQL alternative to Firebase, and it therefore has some similarities in the comparison with Serverpod and some differences as well. Same with Firebase, you use the Supabase SDKs to interact with its database and so on and so forth. Both platforms generate the APIs for you. However, because Supabase uses the schema, it's a little more restricted. It's essentially just an API into your database rather than an API into a backend, because Serverpod uses endpoints to generate its APIs, which means you can do anything, including updating the database, but it's not just limited to. And then finally, how does Serverpod stack up to traditional forms of development? So things like if you were to go, full stack JavaScript, or if you were to go with more of a traditional native front end application with a separate back end application, if you were to use like Swift or Kotlin on the front end to build your apps, or even JavaScript on the web, and then you were to have a separate backend server built in whatever language you like, whether it's Java or Python or. Dart is used for both the front and the back end in full stack Flutter, which comes with a lot of benefits and efficiency. It basically means all of your developers are all full stack developers. The efficiency of having one developer that can edit your front end, your back end, your infrastructure, your deployment process. Every single part of your application can be edited by any one of your developers without having to have separate teams. Serverpod sets up your infrastructure for you using the Terraform scripts. So that's usually something you have to do on your own if you're using a more traditional back-end language. It supports real-time capabilities, and although obviously you can support that using, for example, WebSockets on Node or any of the other frameworks, it usually is quite tricky to set up and it takes a little bit more config, whereas because Dart natively supports streams, it's really simple. It's just like working with a stream like you normally would in Dart. So, MyOpNotes. I just want to essentially give you a bit of an idea of what it's like to use in the real world. So, before I tell you about what MyOpNotes is, it's probably going to be easier if I tell you what the problem we're trying to solve is. So, it probably comes as a surprise to learn that the majority of surgical operations are still actually documented either by hand or using a basic word processor. That means that data is error prone, a lot of things get missed, it's siloed away in an unstructured and unstandardized format that is incredibly difficult to therefore do large-scale research projects or any sort of analysis on that data, because it's essentially just a document or a handwritten, scanned-in PDF that lives in the corner of a server somewhere that never really gets looked at. It also causes significant inaccuracies in clinical coding. Now, I don't really expect you to know what clinical coding is, but behind the scenes, whenever a surgical operation takes place, someone actually looks at that and converts that into standardized clinical codes. But because these operation notes tend to miss out a lot of core details, these codes are wildly inaccurate and can often lead to significant inconsistent billing and inaccurate billing that usually takes a long time to process due to the manual nature of someone having to go through and read it, someone having to check that that's right. We need to solve these problems. So we came up with a solution called MyOpNotes. What is MyOpNotes? It's essentially a templating engine that contains the knowledge of the clinician in a little piece of software. So, why did we choose full stack Flutter? Well, there's a number of considerations you've got to consider from a business perspective, not just a tech perspective, whenever you're creating a new product or creating a new project. Now, we chose Serverpod and full stack Flutter because it ticked all our boxes. For compliance and security, the Terraform scripts that set up our infrastructure came out of the box essentially compliant. All data is encrypted. We can use Serverpod authentication to lock down our endpoints to make sure that endpoints aren't accessible for the wrong users. Scalability, well, again, the Terraform scripts set you up with auto scaling, load balances, and a ton of other features like CDN network using CloudFront, or we're using AWS, but it depends on what backend you use, that really do make it scalable so that we can essentially scale from 0 to infinite just by toggling the amount of instances our server is allowed to spool up, and it should grow and shrink with demand. Interoperability. Now, this was a big one. Dart, obviously, is very interoperable. It works on pretty much all of the platforms. You can actually hook into native code on each platform as well using Dart. It's interoperable with pretty much any standard. And we actually found during the development process that a lot of the standards we had to interoperate with already had packages on pub.dev that had built the majority of the actual connection logic. We just had to add a little bit of extra code on top of that for it to work properly. So it ticks that box. The developer ecosystem and support, as I've mentioned, pub.dev has been sort of a lifesaver for us. It's sped up development so quickly. I'll give you an example. We have pretty complex diagram editor built into our code. It supports Apple Pencil, it supports other styluses. You can draw detailed clinical diagrams using anatomical drawings that we come pre-packaged with the application. You just draw over the top of them. And it was a bit daunting when we first realized that we were going to have to build our own drawing tool. And that was until I got into the nitty gritty of it and we realized just how easy it is. Because Flutter has its own rendering engine, you get to control pretty much every pixel on the screen. So at first we tried a few packages, but when we actually looked under the hood at what those packages were doing, we actually realized, we could probably do a good job of this ourselves without having to rely on any third-party packages. So we ended up developing our own custom drawing application specifically for MyOpNotes, which in traditional development is usually pretty hard for a team of our size to be able to accomplish. Cost efficiency. Now, at MyOpNotes, the cost efficiency side of things has been huge. And Serverpod and Flutter have been a massive help in this. As a team of 4, we've actually managed to build a full clinical application that's compliant and secure in under 18 months with a ton of very advanced features just with the 4 of us. And the reason for that is because all 4 of us are both front-end, back-end, infrastructure, deployment process. Any one of us can edit any part of the code. Data handling and analytics at the moment, it covers the basics, but if you want any sort of in-depth analytics, you're still probably going to be relying on something like Firebase. I am aware that Serverpod team are working quite hard to build that out at the moment. And then finally, user experience. Now, this is a bit of a personal one, but I've worked with a lot of languages. I've worked with, Python, PHP, .NET, JavaScript, Java, Kotlin, Swift. I've kind of seen a lot of languages, and I have to say, out of all of them, Dart and the syntax for Dart and Flutter has to be one of my favorites. I just find, although it does things slightly differently to everyone else, it really does just make sense. It does take a little bit of time to click at first, but once it does click, it's hard to go back to anything else because you expect it to do certain things that you would easily be able to do in Dart and Flutter. So, when should you and when shouldn't you consider using full stack for your project? Now, this might shock you a little bit. I'm not paid, I'm not affiliated in any way to say this. I genuinely think that full stack Flutter is one of the best options for pretty much all UI-centric applications that don't require SEO. That's quite a big statement to make, and I understand that there's going to be a lot of developers out there that sort of, that's a little off-putting. But the gist is, if you are a developer and you already have a stack that works for you, keep going with that stack. But if you want the benefits of being able to have a single code base that deploys to pretty much any platform, a plethora of open source packages with a big community adding to them every day, your front and back end to talk seamlessly as if they're a coupled application, compliant security, back end infrastructure, all of that set up for you, I really couldn't recommend Serverpod and full stack Flutter anymore. Especially, I think, if you're a newer developer. Flutter specifically has one of the lowest barriers of entry to any language, and it supports the widest range of platforms. So if you're a newer developer and you're still trying to figure out what you want to build, whether you want to go into app development with Android and iOS, or whether you want to be a web developer and build web applications, or even whether you want to be a desktop application builder that builds, in-depth, complicated desktop applications that have to be installed, the benefit of using Flutter and learning that first is that not only is it easy to learn and has a lot of resources to learn, but it actually supports all of those. So if you change your mind later down the line about what platforms you want to deploy to, about where you want your code to live, about what even you want to specialize in, you can still use the same stack. You don't have to then go and learn another stack. It changes the model around from identify the platform you want to deploy to, build your app. Right, now what's the next platform we want to deploy to, build your app. It changes that entire process over to, right, let's build our app, and then let's decide which platforms we want to deploy to. Let's start with this one, let's go with that one next, let's go with that one next, but the code never changes. So it really is good for anyone who's newer that's getting into application development, as well as people who are experienced as well, if they want all of those cross-platform and front-end and back-end infrastructure features, then it is really good for you as well. So what have we learned today? Well, hopefully you've learned what full stack Flutter is and how it works, how it compares to alternatives, what full stack Flutter is like in the real world. So hopefully you've got an idea that it can work in even the most compliance riddled settings. and you've also hopefully learned whether or not full stack Flutter is worth considering for your next project. Now, this is an introduction, but there are plenty of resources out there for anyone that wants to delve a little bit deeper, and I would encourage doing so because I genuinely do love full stack Flutter. You know, I've used a lot of stacks in the past, and this definitely is the one that feels the most simplistic yet has the most capabilities. It's just the easiest to use. It's the easiest to sort of get your head around as to how it works. Yet it's one of the most complex in terms of what it can actually do as an end result. So that's been it for me. Thank you so much for listening to this talk. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'm going to be around for the next 15 minutes or so to answer any questions. So if you've got any questions, please post them in the chat below, and I'll get around to answering them. But yeah, thank you very much for watching this talk. It's been a pleasure. I've been Kieran Lee. Have a good one. See you later, guys.